So it's basically you need to start young, really young, and you need to give children the kind of autonomy, as in the sense of you don't just give them everything and ask them to read whatever you feel works for them.
I think our childhood was full of learning from books that were available.
There's reduced attention spans due to the screen exposure that the children are getting at a very early age, right? I think we are going to take away that rule that your daughter has established with your grandchild. All right, so let me just give a brief intro for you. All right. Welcome, dear listeners, to our first episode of Kutubuku Talks. Today, we have the honor of delving into the vibrant mind of Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, a visionary whose passion for innovation, technology, entrepreneurship, education, reading, and writing has left an indelible mark on both the business and literary landscapes. He is an alumnus of distinguished institutions, educational institutions, BIT Mesra, IIT Bombay, NITIE, and Harvard Business School. Apart from being the founder of 5F World and Global Talent Track Foundation and serving on the board of distinguished organizations such as SBI and NASSCOM, he had also served as the CEO of Sensor Technologies in the past. He has authored 12 books, with India's Pathways to Success being his latest book, and he has written countless articles. He is also the recipient of very prestigious awards such as the CEO of the Year by the Asia Pacific HR Conference in 1999 and many, many, many more accolades. It is indeed an honor and privilege to have you here on Kutubuku Talks as our first guest, sir.
Thank you, Ria. I think it's great to see what you and Shweta are doing. So look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, sir. So we can delve into a conversation. Being a tech leader, an established author, a voracious reader, and a life-changing presence to many, could you maybe share with us brief snippets of your journey with books and reading and into the literary space in general?
Actually, it's a very interesting question because, if you asked me 65 years ago, I would never have imagined that I would turn out to be an author and all that kind of good stuff. Because I grew up actually in a very small village. And that is, for people who don't know the east of India, it's very close to Ranchi, which is the capital of Jharkhand. And I actually grew up in a village called Tattasilbai. Why did I grow up there? Because my father, who obviously was born and raised in Tamil Nadu, but then moved to Calcutta, set up a company along with two other gentlemen called Waxpol, which was more in industrial lubricants, then set up the factory in this little village. So my sister and I actually grew up in that village. And most of our friends were village kids. So we had the opportunity to study in a convent school about 5 kilometers away, in another village called Namkum. But obviously, the quality of education was not all that great. Now, it was an English missionary school, so clearly we were taught in English, which was a privilege we had over many of our friends in the village. But I still remember when I was in class 7 or 8, I went and asked my principal because I had just heard of an entity called IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology. Today, of course, I think people hear about IITs while they're still in their mother's womb. So it's like almost that much of a well known, but we were like completely ignorant. So I remember going and talking to the principal's name was Fitzgerald. We used to call him Fitzy. And asking Fitzy, I said, Fitzy, I want to get into IIT. And he said, hold on, let me finish laughing. I said, why are you laughing? He says, no, we don't teach you good enough physics, chemistry, and math to get into IITs. So you'll have to make sure that you understand that. So I was very crestfallen and I asked him, but then Fitzy, what do I do? He said, look, one thing we have taught you is excellent English. So you know English language, you love reading books, you are a person who can, talk in debates and elocutions, etc. Make that your vocation. I said, but surely just speaking good English or reading English all the time doesn't make you successful. He said, of course it does. He said, when you're 65 years old and you look back and ask yourself, what have you achieved in life, either in terms of inspiring others, being inspired yourself, you'll discover that English had a big role to play. So long answer to your question, Rhea, but my own journey of English happened by accident because I had very few English-speaking friends. So I used to perpetually be lost in the world of books. And I think that helped because it gave you a vocabulary, as our good friend Shashi Tharoor keeps saying, by being a slightly unhealthy child in his early years, he ended up losing himself in the world of books. And in a sense, it's very true for me. So the love of the language, the love of reading all kinds of fiction, non-fiction. I think that's what really got me into the habit of reading. And in a sense, it was through adversity of not being in a great school. But looking back, I think it was something that I really enjoyed. And you mentioned my 12 books, by the way. The last book is the 13th book, which
Oh,
is actually my first novel. It's called A Passage Through Life,
yeah.
where I describe some of this. I describe it in the character of a young woman growing up in
Okay.
Jharkhand. But she
Okay.
goes through the life experiences that I had in terms of learning, in terms of being successful, in spite of not being great in academics. And I think that's really what my journey has been all about. But I've loved reading books, and I really can't imagine anybody not in a world of books at this point of time.
That's great to know. I'm also curious to know at this point. So, how available or accessible were books at that point? I know you were studying in a convent school, and they probably had a library. But was that your source of books, or
Hardly, the library was really awful. So, but fortunately, my father was himself apart from running an industry,
yeah?
he was a social worker. He was part of the Tamil Sangam in Ranchi. So literally it
Mhm.
meant that every evening we would be bundled into a car and travel 10 kilometers to the city. And the bribe he gave us was that, look, every 3 days we could go to the place, to a little place called Good Books and buy a book. So literally within maybe the first 8 years of my reading life, I had finished all the Enid Blytons. In those days, I mean, growing up was always with around the
Yeah.
fancy world of the English countryside with Enid Blyton.
Right.
That was my first introduction. So even today, I mean, if you come to my home in Pune, we have three separate libraries. Okay, one is the library in the basement where we have all the Enid Blytons. Then we
Wow.
have all the other books we've accumulated, fiction, non-fiction. So the house is surrounded by books. And in fact, right now I'm in New York. And if you come to my daughter's house in New York, you can't see the wall because everything is books. All their entire house is full of books. So book reading has become a bit of a habit. So accessibility, to answer your question, was difficult. But fortunately, because of good books and a couple of other English places, I mean, we could graduate from Enid Blytons to A.J. Cronins and Alistair MacLean's and what have you. So I think our childhood was full of learning from books that were available. And yes, we had a library in the school, but I think that was probably one more source of inspiration or reading for my sister and I as we grew up in school.
Wonderful, right. That's the dream. The three libraries in a house is practically our dream. Now that you're in this position currently, and you know it's been 65 years since that young child was laughed at about his IIT Bombay dream, right? How would you say your current reading patterns are like? Do you still find time to read? Is it something that you manage to get time for, or do you have a separate space for it, or?
I'd be lying if I said I'm reading as much as I used to in the past, because till about 10 years back, literally would be reading a book, whether fiction or non-fiction, at least one a week. And because of lots of travel, I mean, for the last 30 years, I've been on planes most of the time. I mean, the reading habit is also there. But today, quite honestly, in the last 5 years, there's so much of distraction from social media. And I'm a very avid follower of social media. So I do a lot of blogging, posting on whether it's on what used to be Twitter, X,
Yeah,
LinkedIn, of course,
yeah.
Facebook, and the audiovisual medium is so easy, with pictures and everything else. I think I'm reading less than I would like to. But the good point is that I'm finding that people who are reading even today, like both my daughter and my son-in-law, they're perpetually with their books. So they're like probably my son-in-law and daughter both even today read at least a book a week. So I think that habit gets you into saying that look, let's learn from each other. So
Yeah.
we are part of reading clubs. We still love to interact with children, including my own 5-year-old grandchild, who is just getting into reading. So I
Mhm.
think reading is a part of what we do as a family. So inevitably, whether it is short reading through attachments through Twitter or LinkedIn, or through longer editions of what we read, I think it helps. And in any case, my wife and I at least write one book a year. So that also gives you the need to research. So for pathways to India's success, for instance, we did huge amounts of reading because we really wanted to know what every economist and every philosopher had to say about India's future. So
Yeah.
that gives you a reading thing. Right now, we are researching a book called Nari Shakti, where we are reading up on all aspects of women empowerment and the
Mhm.
new women's reservation bill. So
Yeah.
if you make reading a prerequisite to what you do in life, you find that reading becomes part of your process. It's not a kind of task by itself. So that's
Right.
the way I see reading. Actually.
Right. And that's the message we want to kind of impart to families, the family that reads together, stays together, nurtures each other and grows together, right? So that's absolutely wonderful. You did mention that social media as such, and social media is always put in a villainous space when it comes to reading. Like, they're not supposed to be the same thing. But you did put it in wonderfully that, short reads, if whether it's reading from X or doing your research, social media does play a part in it. And you've been observing the youth and their patterns and the ways in which they are in a professional setup as well as in the personal setup very closely, I assume. What are your observations or your thoughts about their current reading habits amongst youth?
See, amongst youth, I mean, I'm probably going to exaggerate this, but I think it's almost non-existent, and that is a bit of a worry, because it also happens because when the new generations, let's say somebody today who is 18 years old, right from the early days, reading has been more of a chore and more of something that they had to do to pass their exams than a matter of pleasure. And I think it's important for all of us as parents, grandparents, to
Yeah,
inculcate the love of reading in children and grandchildren. Because the youth of today, and we do a lot of work with youth. I mean, the companies you mentioned,
yeah,
Global Talent Track, for
yeah,
instance, we work with over 2 million youth across the country and including in Malaysia and China, and trying to see how they are learning, what their learning processes are. And similarly, in the social work we do, an entity called Lighthouse Communities, we
yeah,
were working with slum youth in 5 states. The
yeah,
same thing. So what we are trying to do is make sure that they are literate. Numeracy, digital literacy, and English literacy. But they want to learn more from other people who said that, and that's something we are trying to inculcate. But generally speaking, I think the biggest problem we have, especially with single kids of both parents working, is that the easiest way to tell a child to keep quiet is probably to give them a phone and let them play a game,
yeah,
which I think is very detrimental to long-term growth of
right,
children. Because I
yeah,
mean, my daughter has this rule that her son will never get more than maybe 25 minutes of screen time during a day. Now, whether that's the television screen, the mobile screen, or the computer screen. No, I think that's a great practice, because when I watch kids, who are literally immersed in their screen 4 hours at a time, I think somewhere we are kind of taking away their potential to
yes,
think on their own. Because if you're just constantly watching stuff that is being bombarded to you on a screen, you're
right,
never going to develop the cognitive capabilities that many of us discovered by imagination. And
exactly.
that imagination thing is very important, that you get
Yeah,
more from books than from
yeah,
watching television or your mobile phone.
yeah. And especially when it comes to attention spans, and there are a lot of studies that kind of are leading to the fact that there is reduced attention spans due to the screen exposure that the children are getting at a very early age, right? Absolutely, we totally agree with you on that. And I think we are going to take away that rule that your daughter has established with your grandchild. 25 minutes of screen time should work, right? All right.
Yeah, at both. In fact, she tries to minimize that and says that, look, maybe I should not even do that much. But I mean, let's see how it goes out. And
Yeah.
interestingly, I mean, yesterday, just as an
Mhm.
incident, I was reading one of the books that you folks sent me for my grandson,
Yeah.
and I found it absolutely fascinating. Because we all have heard the good old Humpty Dumpty story.
Right.
Here is a little book that has been written autobiographically by Humpty Dumpty.
Yeah.
He writes it in a very, it's written in a very wonderful kind of style, which says, "Hi, I'm Humpty Dumpty. I'm
Right.
famous for having fallen off the wall."
Yeah.
It starts like that. So
Yeah.
even I was fascinated at my age, saying I must read this book. I mean, it's
Right.
so well written. So I
Yeah.
think the other thing that we must remember
After
is
the fall. After the fall by
exactly,
Jane Stanley.
exactly. My God, you remember that? Yeah, absolutely. I haven't even read it fully yet, but I have to. I'm just waiting for this evening to
Yeah.
read it to my grandson,
Right.
because I know he loves these kind of workabouts and these corny ways of telling stories. Of course,
Yeah.
he's heard Humpty Dumpty.
Yes.
Why not read the same nursery rhyme? So
Right.
getting their imagination kind of tingling,
Absolutely.
if you will, is
Yeah.
one way of reading. And I think it's important for us to innovatively think of ways to get children to read, because
Yeah.
they must read.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I went to London, and this was
Mhm.
probably in the 1991 or something like that. And it was almost as though I already knew the place, because
Yeah.
having been the five find outers and the secret seven and
Yeah.
walked Devon and
And
Dorset and
Sherlock
all,
Holmes,
yeah,
maybe.
it was almost like you were there. So
Yeah.
that's your imagination.
Right.
And then you also realize that, look, some things you imagined without having seen the place is actually different from reality.
Right.
Okay, including the fact that the Thames River is so much smaller than it was in your imagination.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
the joy of discovery that people
Right.
should not deny their children by not letting them or not encouraging them to read.
Correct. Absolutely. That's a wonderful insight. So I think you just answered my next question on how would you suggest promoting reading to children within families, right? You just gave an example without really being explicit about it. Reading with your grandchild, you're looking forward to that reading aloud time with him, right? So I think that's one of the things that can promote reading with children. I mean, reading habit within children. Are there other ways that you could think of that? You talked about some initiatives that you have. Of course, you're not talking about children at that point. You're talking about the youth on literacy, right? On how you deal with literacy and English literacy specifically in your company, right? So how do you go about that? Like how does the process work? Is
I
there?
think there has to be a motive. Again, it's a question of saying, if you say that, look, you must be digitally literate and you must know English, people say, yeah, of course, I know that. But I mean, it doesn't kind of hit your core
Yeah,
sense. And
yeah,
I'll answer your question in a little roundabout way. I remember when we were first setting up a digital literacy center in this
right.
place called Sudumbre, which is very close to Pune. And myself and the MP who was kind of supporting that activity, a lady called Vandana Chauhan. So Vandana and I went there. We set up a digital literacy center. We had all kinds of content available on 4 computers. And then we did a bit of a mapping, and we found that there were about 3,200 youth in that village. So Vandana and I told ourselves that, look, we'll just leave it here. It's almost like it's there, it's available with the content. And we'll go back after 3 months. And I'm sure by then 1,500 of those youth would have really grabbed onto it. So I remember going back to that village after almost 4 months, and we found the same youth, hanging around in the village corridor, courtyards, and nobody near there. So we said, look, why aren't you going to that center? There's so much content. So he says in Hindi, "हमको तो time ही नहीं मिलता." I said, why don't you get time? He said, no, 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 we are not getting time in the center. So I said, if you as youth are not going into the digital literacy center, who's going? He said, you go and find out. So we went there, and we had the three old women sitting on the computers. Okay, one was 80 years old. And we asked her, Tai, which is the Marathi word for elder sister, said, Tai, what are you doing here? So she says, look, my son keeps going to the nearby villages. He'll come back and say, we've got this great matrimonial alliance for my daughter. And this guy has so many bigas of land, etc., etc. She said, I go into the internet and I find out how much land owning this man really has.
Yeah.
The man must be old, 80 years old, minded.
Yeah.
The other woman, like 60, 65, and they asked her, what are you doing? He said, no, no, whenever my husband goes to Bombay, he comes back and says, I bought you this wonderful dress for 400 rupees. So I go to Flipkart and show it to him that it's available for 250. Vandana and I were holding our heads saying, are we creating marital discord here? No, but it's so fascinating
Right.
that they found the real motivation to read and
Yeah.
serve the internet, etc.
Right.
And we then discovered this. I mean, even with my own grandson, I was mentioning, yesterday I was showing him a book, and there's a long sentence there which he can't read yet. But the picture was so interesting that he's telling me, Tata, you please read that and tell me what it says. So kind of, then we read it together. Okay, so the motivation to do it because it's something you want to do has to come.
Yeah.
Teachers putting, I mean, in the good old days, teachers saying that, look, I mean, you'll get punished if you don't read this book tomorrow morning, is one way of negative motivation.
Right.
But the real positive pull factor will come when they feel themselves enriched on account of reading. And I
Right.
think, as it's true for the 80-year-old woman in Sudumbre, it's
Right.
true for the youth who are not reading because they don't see the point, and
Yeah.
absolutely true for young people who don't know anything better to do. I mean, so if they have books and if they think that they'll get fascinating stories by reading them, why not? So I
Yeah.
think we have to be very careful. And I think what you guys are doing in your company is absolutely fascinating because you're kind of bringing out that need or that urge to learn
Right.
by laddering the learning experience. I
Yeah.
mean, you're ensuring that somebody reads an easy book and then goes one level higher in the level of competence.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely the best way, Ria. And if
Yeah.
people continue to do this, I'm sure a lot more families will be much, much more rich because of your experience.
That's the dream again. Yeah. So we also make sure that each child is different, right? So the books are aligned to their interests
Yeah.
and things that they would like to explore further. Because, like you said, if the innate curiosity is not there, you can't just put it into their head that you need to read. The whole negative reinforcement thing does not work anymore. Never did. It was in the sustainable way of doing it, but I think that is the idea as such. Yes, which brings us to our next question. Is there anything you wish was done differently in schools, the community, and in families that would help children grow up into critically thinking adults who have in them the empathy to care for the rest of the world?
See, it's an interesting question, and I mean, I honestly don't have the real answer to this because if you talk to people who are constantly sending their children to the West, and whether it's US or UK or wherever, and you ask them, they think, oh, our children, we don't want them to get exposed to this rote-based learning, and you mug up subjects and you don't learn anything, etc.
Mhm.
And for many years, I had this dilemma saying that, look, I mean, I studied almost entirely in India. The Harvard Business School stint was, I mean, literally 15 years ago when I was already the CEO of a company. But if you look at my experience with NITIE, which is of course now IIM Mumbai, and then of course IIT Bombay, PhD, etc., it was all about learning the traditional method, and I didn't feel denied because of that. Today, if you look at the Sundar Pichais and Satya Nadellas and all the big success stories in the West, I mean, they're all people who came out of Hyderabad Public School and IIT Bombay and wherever else. So,
Yeah.
and I remember having a very interesting conversation with this gentleman called CK Prala, who's obviously very famous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think I was traveling from Michigan back to Mumbai, sitting together in the same plane. So to be nice to him, I started the conversation by saying that, Professor Prahlad, I'm sure I mean, you also see that, the American style of, liberal arts education is based on what you want and not what we want you to learn. Isn't that better? He told me something which I've never forgotten. He said, never ever decry the Indian education system. And if you go back to the early days of the education system, where people were taken to gurukuls when they were 12 years old,
Right.
and as he said, literally crammed with information till it came out of your ears. He
Mhm.
says by putting that, in your head when you're at a very early stage in your life, as you grew up, and when you got into experiences, then you kind of it recirculated in your mind and it came out and said, oh, this is what I seem to have learned. Okay. So he
Yeah.
says there's no one way of saying this is the best way. As you said earlier, yeah, every child is different. I mean, maybe many of our extremely intelligent IIT kids who are now doing extremely well abroad
Mm.
are kids who grew up through the traditional method of Indian education, but doing extremely well.
Right.
And maybe there are many kids, like my own daughter went to, after doing ICSE in Bombay,
Mhm.
she went off to the United World College in the US to do high school, then was in Cambridge and Harvard, etc. Her learning experiences have been different everywhere. But
Right.
she's really flourished because what she went in when she went into IB from ICSE, it
Mm.
was a very different style of learning, and it took her maybe 3 months to adjust. And then immediately she went off to Cambridge, where you learn more through the eight people tutorials than by hearing a Nobel laureate giving you a big lecture.
Right.
And then the learn by yourself style of US. And she said, look, I enjoyed each one of it.
Yeah.
Different styles, but
Right.
different ways of learning. And so that's what I'm saying. We should not constrain our thinking by saying this is good or that is bad.
Right.
Maybe a child will flourish through this form of education or that. So give them the freedom to experiment.
Right.
And the same thing to do with reading. Okay, let
Yeah.
them read what they like to read. If you
Yes.
think reading Archie comics is trash, maybe it's
Right.
not for somebody else. Okay, so and it also gives you some views of the world which you should learn.
Yeah.
So any format, any genre, but read you must. I think that's
Yes.
the model.
Yes. Yeah. Do you have any, you did just tell the parents of our community what they could possibly do to enrich their child's life, which is like, read, you must. So thank you for that. And I think that's all that uh, we can have from you right now. Thank you
No,
so
but I
much.
would I would then suggest that especially for parents who are listening to this,
Right.
especially if you're in smaller towns,
Yeah.
please encourage library formation. I mean,
Yeah.
I did a very large project with Michael and Susan Dell Foundation about 4 years back when I
Right.
was chairman of NASSCOM Foundation. They actually paid us money and we talked to the library folks in India and said, let us revive the public library system. I
Yes.
mean, actually, apart from my good books, there was a
Right.
wonderful library called the British Council Library.
Yeah.
And the British Council Library itself was a phenomenon in many small towns as we grew up in India. So we
Mm-hmm.
need more public libraries. We need more public libraries with contemporary books. And
Right.
I think it's important in your communities to ensure even lending libraries,
Right.
where you can borrow a book and give it back and maybe pay whatever for it. So I
Right.
think this has to happen in cities. Because if we, as I said, if we completely subjugate ourselves to artificial intelligence and social media, we're going to lose something somewhere. And I don't even read books on Kindle. Although my other tech friends think I'm crazy, but I said, look, unless I smell a book,
I
I can't.
need the page. I need to smell the page.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the joy of book reading. So
Yeah.
I think it's something that you have to communicate in whichever format you can to
Yes.
your children and people you can surround, because I think we owe it to the next generation
Right.
to, to give them the pleasure of reading, which many of us have enjoyed through our lives.
Thank you so much, sir. That was indeed a great conversation to have about books and reading. And you took me to a place that is closest to our hearts, the libraries, right? Have you, where would you say your favorite library is? You've been traveling all over the world. Have you
Honestly,
been?
my favorite library is the Baker Library in Harvard Business School,
Ah,
because you can never, it's a building by itself, and I don't even know how many thousands, tens of thousands of books there are.
right.
And that's absolutely amazing. But
Yeah.
in terms of other libraries, especially the fiction types, I'm not saying, I mean, I think it's a kind of almost like a diminishing or a disappearing kind of practice. So I
Mhm.
hope to see more of those, especially for children to go. So,
Right,
what
right. I think there are a few libraries that are coming up in Bangalore, which has a lending library sort of setup, but it's not as rampant or as popular as libraries used to be back in the time. So, yeah, it's a huge call out for the communities to start public libraries or
we have
renovate.
a general election coming up. Only
Yeah,
vote for people who are well read.
right. Well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Oh, thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Ria.
That's
Pleasure talking
come
to
to
you.
the
And
end of our interview. Thank you so much. And thank you for remembering our books too. After the Fall is a very special book for us because it just doesn't talk about Humpty Dumpty. It also talks about very intense topics like, changing one's lives, life changing, how,
I'm going to
yeah.
go read it right now.
Oh, okay. I'm not going to break the suspense. Please go ahead. All right. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being with us today. Thank you. Have a great day. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye bye.